To summarize Joshua into one sentence, we could say that it is the preparation for accompanying the Lord. It was the attitude of accompanying the Lord, whereas Leviticus was the eligibility of accompanying the Lord, Numbers was the method of accompanying the Lord, and Deuteronomy was the principle of accompanying the Lord. Since Torah was the textbook for accompanying the Lord, Joshua was a workbook to exercise the textbook. Especially, it gives us an important spiritual message on the saint's attitude to fulfill Jesus' command and enjoy our privilege given by him. Let's learn the method and try to put it into practice in our daily lives. The Old Testament. Follow the sequence from ages, leaders, key places, key words, national perspective, and authorities perspective to the genealogy of Jesus, the book's allocation, and their representative triplets, the spiritual perspective of prophets, and lastly BC and Adam's chronicle. Please open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 12, verse 14. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. Since they entered Egypt in 2238 of the Adam Chronicle, the year they came out of Egypt was 2668. The time background of Deuteronomy was in the 40th year after they had come out of Egypt. Joshua was about the story from just after Deuteronomy to completely conquering the land, but chronically we need to consider the end of the conquest AG as the death of Joshua. It was presumed that the Israelites took just 6 to 7 years to conquer the land, led by Joshua as stated chapter 14 verse 10. So here I am today, 85 years old, when Caleb conquered Hebron, which was the last battle as written in verse 15. Since Caleb was 40 years old when he explored the land from Kadesh during the second year after the exodus from Egypt. 3 pillars. The Lord had given the Israelites the instructions on how to be holy in Leviticus and how to live with the Lord in Numbers. Moses gave the Israelites the instructions on how to live in the promised land. Joshua gave us an instruction on how to live after our salvation. It helps us realize the difference between salvation and a blessed life. As you know, Joshua was the story about the Israelites conquering the promised land. The story was summarized to 3 P's, triple P's. The first P was provision. Provision for what? It was the provision to spiritually discipline the Israelites to fulfill their mission by conquering the land given to them by the Lord. The Lord disciplined Joshua first by restating the territory of the promised land in chapter 1 verse 4. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon and from the great river Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the great sea on the west. And he encouraged Joshua to be strong and courageous because he would be with him and never leave him nor forsake him, as stated in verse 5. This was the Lord's promise to Joshua and also toward us. He will never leave and forsake us. A significance was verse 8, when the Lord gave him an instruction on how to prosper and be successful. It was 3 steps. Don't let the book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night. Then you will be able to do everything written in it. This is a very important key for us to put the words of the Lord into practice in our daily lives. Do you want to do the things that are written in the Bible? But it is never too easy to do it. How do we do it as per verse 8? We have to read and meditate on it day and night. Why did the Lord command Joshua to do this? Because of Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 19, the Lord commanded him to do this. What was it? It was for a king. Since Joshua was a leader of the Israelites, the Lord commanded him this as a king. This was a provision for leader Joshua. The next providence was the exploration of Jericho to convince them through their earlier failure. This time Joshua sent only 2 spies to Jericho. They met Rahab, who helped them escape the enemy. They were convinced by her. This was probably a test by the Lord again to check whether or not they trusted in him. The Lord commanded Joshua to circumcise the Israelites because they couldn't do it in the desert. From a spiritual point of view, it was a ceremony to qualify them as God's people to conquer Jericho and convince them that they belonged to the Lord. As stated in the end of chapter 5, verse 13 to 15, the Lord visited Joshua to convince him like he did for Moses. This was probably an official ceremony to select him as the leader of the Israelites. The Lord disciplined the Israelites about serving the Lord by observing the law with all their strength through Achan's incident. We also often face the same temptation of materials in our offerings. We have to love the Lord more than materials, or it would be an act of idolatry in our lives. Promised land. The second pillar of Joshua was about the promised land. During the invasion of the land, the Lord presented his almighty of controlling the nature by stopping the sun and the moon for a long time until the Israelites defeated the Amorites, as stated in chapter 10, verse 12 to 15. Joshua almost conquered the promised land, except for a few specific areas as stated in chapter 13, verse 1 to 7. And he distributed the land to the Israelites tribes as their inheritance except to the Levites. A significance was the order of distribution among the tribes. Let's see it in the next slide. These 3 topics, the Lord's providence in conquering the land to be taken, and inheritance, were major stories related to the promised land. Propose. The last story was about the purpose of the book of Joshua for the readers over the generations. This story began with the tribes who occupied the east of the Jordan River. Who were they? The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Why did the Lord give them the east lands, which was not part of the promised land? Reuben was physically the firstborn from Leah, who was the first wife of Jacob, and Gad was the firstborn from Zilpah, who was a slave wife of Jacob. Manasseh was physically the first son of Joseph against Ephraim, who was spiritually the firstborn from Joseph, but lost the qualification later due to their idolatry. Only Manasseh was given both the east and west of the Jordan River. Hence, these tribes were worried about their identification much later because they would live outside of the promised land. So they built an imposing altar by the Jordan, as written in chapter 22, verse 10, as an evidence for their part in the chosen people. From a spiritual point of view, this brings us 2 important messages for our identification as Christians. The first is the eagerness to represent their identification. We need to follow this attitude. We must not be shameful in representing ourselves as Christians to other people. The other one is on how to represent the identification. They inscribed on the stone for memory, but we have to represent it through our deeds and behavior, which should be set apart from worldly people. In other words, we have to build a spiritual altar wherever we are. We have to be proud that we are the chosen and saved people. The last 2 chapters were about Joshua's last speech. Chapter 23 began with him asking the people. He emphasized the laws. He commanded the people to obey all that was written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or to the left, as stated in chapter 23, verse 6. And he also commanded them not to associate with the people that remained among them in the land. This is applicable to us today. We must obey the words written in the Bible without turning aside to the right or to the left, and not associate with the worldly culture and matters. Here, notice a lesson on how we need to keep ourselves away from worldly matters. It is to read and meditate on the Bible first. God's words will protect us and lead us to walk on all the ways that Jesus taught. Chapter 24 began with a recollection of the Lord's providence done to his people since the Lord had called Abraham as his chosen person. He requested the people to make a resolution on whether or not they serve the Lord. He declared that he and all his household will serve the Lord as seen in chapter 24, verse 15. He is asking us also to make a decision on whether or not we will serve the Lord. Will you and your household serve the Lord? Yes, this is a really important message to us. You may have some family members who do not know the Lord and Jesus. You have to first preach the gospel to them, and you have to pray for your marriage so that you will meet a spouse who has faith in Jesus and will build a perfect family in Jesus Christ. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people at Shechem. He drew up for them decrees and laws as stated in chapter 24, verse 25. What is the covenant for us today? It is the Bible which we have. In order to obey the covenant, we have to first study it and meditate on it day and night, because we are spiritual leaders as stated in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praise of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. The key verse is the Joshua's resolution as written in chapter 24, verse 15. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Thank you for watching.